On a distant planet, far beyond Earth's reach, humanity had begun to spread across the stars. With every new colony, humanity grew stronger, becoming a vital part of the galaxy. One such colony, located on a quiet and seemingly unimportant world, was home to a family known as the Caldwells. The Caldwell family, though not widely known, held a secret, one that had been passed down for generations. It was in the early hours of the morning that the youngest member of the Caldwell family first noticed something strange. He had always been ordinary, content with his work as a scientist. But lately, his mind had felt sharper, his senses more attuned to the world around him. It was as though a hidden part of him was beginning to awaken, something that had remained dormant for years, buried deep within his bloodline. He had no idea what was happening to him at first. It started with small, seemingly insignificant changes. A flash of energy that no one else could see, a sudden burst of strength that caught him off guard, and the strange feeling that his body no longer needed to follow the rules of ordinary human biology. He felt stronger, faster, almost as if he were becoming something more than human. One evening, as he sat in his small laboratory, the feeling grew stronger. A faint glow appeared around his hands, almost as if energy was pulsing from his very skin. The sensation was not painful, but it was strange and disorienting. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things, but as the glow grew brighter, he realized something extraordinary was happening to him. He felt his skin, the very cells within his body, shifting in ways he couldn't explain. At first, he tried to ignore it, focusing on his work to distract himself. But every day, the changes became more obvious. His reflection in the mirror began to reveal something different. His skin seemed to shimmer, taking on a faint blue hue that deepened as the days went by. His eyes, too, began to glow faintly, reflecting the light in a way they never had before. With each passing day, the changes became more intense. His clothes no longer fit him as they once had. They were too tight, uncomfortable, and he felt a strange compulsion to remove them. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his body no longer required clothing at all. His skin, now smooth and metallic in appearance, seemed to be enough to protect him from the elements. It was as if he no longer needed to hide behind layers of fabric, as if the body he had been born with was transforming into something more powerful. He couldn't explain why this was happening. He wasn't sure if anyone else had ever experienced such a thing, but he knew it was something deeply connected to his family's legacy. The Caldwells had always been known for their brilliance, their incredible intellect, and their mysterious ties to an ancient force that even they did not fully understand. The family's history was filled with whispers of a powerful dormant genetic trait that could one day be awakened, if the right person in the family was born at the right time. It seemed that time had come. The protagonist knew he couldn't ignore what was happening to him any longer. He began to research the history of his family, seeking answers that had been hidden for centuries. As he pored over ancient texts and records, he discovered stories about ancestors who had undergone similar transformations. These stories spoke of humans who had unlocked powers beyond comprehension, abilities to manipulate energy, to control the varied fabric of reality. But these powers had always been lost, their bearers fading into myth and legend. Now, it seemed that the power had found its way back into the Caldwell bloodline. He was the one to carry it forward, though he had no idea what it meant or how to control it. What he did know was that the changes happening within him were not natural. They were the result of something greater, something connected to the very origins of humanity's journey across the stars. Days passed, and he grew more accustomed to his new abilities. He no longer needed food or water as often, and his mind raced with new thoughts and ideas. His body felt alive in ways it never had before, each cell buzzing with energy. It was as though he could feel the pulse of the universe itself coursing through his veins. But with these powers came uncertainty. The protagonist knew he wasn't the only one in the galaxy who would notice his transformation. There were powerful forces, alien races, ruthless governments, and factions in the galaxy who would want to control this new power. They would stop at nothing to use him for their own purposes or eliminate him if he became a threat. For now, he was alone in his discovery, but he couldn't remain hidden forever. Word would spread, and he would have to face the consequences of his transformation. Yet, deep down, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of destiny that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was something greater, something that could change the course of human history. As he stared out at the stars through the window of his laboratory, the protagonist made a vow to himself. He would find out everything he could about the legacy of the Caldwells, and he would learn how to control the powers that now flowed through him. He was no longer just a human. He was something else, something new. And he would make sure that humanity's place in the galaxy would be secured, no matter the cost. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. The days following his strange awakening were filled with confusion and uncertainty. The protagonist, now aware of his transformation, knew that his powers were growing stronger by the day. But as his abilities expanded, so did the dangers surrounding him. He had barely begun to understand the depths of the changes within him when he began to realize something far more pressing. Others were beginning to notice. The galaxy had long been divided among powerful alien factions, each vying for control over the stars. The humans had always been seen as weak, scattered across different colonies, struggling to survive, and never truly uniting. But now, something was different, and the alien empires that ruled over them could not ignore the rise of a new power. It wasn't long before the first sign of danger appeared. A fleet of unknown ships entered the solar system, their presence marked by advanced technology and intimidating weaponry. These ships belonged to the Praxians, a ruthless, militaristic alien race known for their brutal tactics and desire for dominance. The Praxians had long viewed humanity as a minor species, unworthy of attention. But now, they were coming to investigate the strange rumors surrounding the new powerful humans. And if these rumors were true, they would do whatever it took to eliminate the threat before it could grow any larger. The protagonist was the first target. One evening, while he was working alone in his laboratory, a sudden, sharp noise broke his concentration. The walls seemed to shake with the force of something heavy crashing down outside. The protagonist's heart raced as he quickly moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Several large, black ships had descended onto the surface of the colony. Praxian soldiers, clad in dark armor and wielding energy weapons, began to pour out of the ships. They were swift, organized, and merciless. It was clear that they had come for one purpose: to capture or kill whoever had begun to awaken the power they had sensed in humanity. The protagonist knew that they were after him. He didn't have much time. With no other choice, he ran through the back corridors of the colony, using the skills and abilities that were still foreign to him. The first time he tried to run, his legs felt heavier than they should. But as he pushed himself, he could feel his body changing, adjusting, adapting. He sprinted faster, his movements becoming more fluid, more controlled. The Praxians were close, and the protagonist could hear the sound of their footsteps growing louder behind him. But just as panic began to set in, something inside him clicked. He reached out with his mind, focusing on the energy that seemed to be flowing through his body. In a burst of sudden power, he pushed his hand forward, and the walls around him shook. The Praxians, who had been closing in, were thrown back by an invisible force. He had no idea how he had done it, but the result was clear. He had just used his newfound abilities to fight back. The sound of the Praxians' confusion and anger only pushed him forward. He knew that the colony was no longer safe. They would keep coming for him, and they would bring more ships, more soldiers, more advanced weapons. There was no way to stay hidden any longer. He needed to leave. Using the last of his strength, he ran toward the outskirts of the colony, towards a hidden escape pod that he had only heard about in stories. It was an old piece of technology, once used for emergency evacuations, but it had been abandoned long ago. However, the protagonist had always kept a map of the colony's forgotten areas. His family's history was one of secrecy and protection, and he had learned to trust his instincts. The escape pod might be the only way to get away from the Praxians before they overwhelmed the entire colony. As he reached the pod, he quickly realized it was not going to be an easy escape. The Praxians had sent a team of soldiers to intercept him. They were closing in fast. He had no choice but to act. As they approached, he reached out again, this time with more focus. The air around him vibrated with energy. The soldiers stopped in their tracks, their weapons raised. But before they could react, he unleashed a burst of energy, throwing them back in a flash of light. He didn't wait to see if they would get up. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, he boarded the escape pod, slamming the door shut behind him. The pod's engines roared to life, and within seconds, he was soaring away from the colony, leaving the chaos behind. But as he flew through the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had survived the Praxians' first assault, but the galaxy was vast, and there were many forces that would soon learn of his existence. The Praxians weren't the only ones who would want to control his power or destroy him. As the escape pod hurtled through space, the protagonist looked out into the vast unknown. His journey had only just begun. The future of humanity rested on his shoulders, and he would need to learn to master his abilities if he was to stand a chance against the powerful forces that were sure to come. In the distance, the stars shimmered. The protagonist knew that the real challenge was only just starting. The escape pod drifted through the void of space, its engines humming softly as the protagonist tried to catch his breath. The immediate danger had passed, but his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had barely escaped the Praxians, but he knew they wouldn't stop searching for him. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, and he was now a target. As he floated in the endless silence, his mind turned inward, trying to make sense of what had happened to him. He had felt the power inside him, but it was still unfamiliar, unpredictable. Every time he used his abilities, it was like tapping into something ancient and vast, a force that he didn't fully understand. He had to learn to control it, or it would destroy him. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The Praxians would be relentless, and there were other factions in the galaxy who might want to exploit his newfound powers. If he wanted to survive, he needed answers. He needed to understand where his abilities came from, and how he could use them to protect humanity. The escape pod's systems beeped, indicating that it had detected a nearby planet. The protagonist adjusted the pod's trajectory, heading toward the planet's surface. It was a small, remote world, far from the major trade routes. There were no signs of civilization, just a barren, rocky landscape stretching out below. He had no idea what to expect, but he needed to find a safe place to land and regroup. As the pod descended through the atmosphere, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if the planet itself was calling to him. There was something about this place that felt familiar, almost as if it had been waiting for him. The protagonist shook off the thought. He couldn't afford to get distracted. He needed to stay focused. The pod touched down with a soft thud on the planet's surface. The landing was smooth, but the quiet outside made it feel like the calm before a storm. As the hatch opened, a rush of cold air filled the small cabin, and the protagonist stepped out, feeling the weight of the planet beneath his feet. The landscape stretched out before him, rocky cliffs and barren plains. It was desolate, yet there was something strangely beautiful about it. He looked around, scanning the horizon for any sign of life. But there was nothing, no animals, no plants, no sign of intelligent life at all. It was as if this place had been abandoned by the universe itself. The protagonist walked for hours, his mind still racing with thoughts of what had happened to him. He felt a strange pull, like an invisible force guiding him forward. It was the same feeling he had sensed when he first arrived on the planet. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something deeper, an instinct, a call to something ancient and hidden. Eventually, he came to a large cave entrance. The mouth of the cave was dark and foreboding, but there was something in the air, something that told him he was supposed to go inside. He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the cave, the darkness swallowing him whole. As he ventured deeper into the cave, the air grew cooler, and the silence grew heavier. He could hear nothing but his own footsteps echoing off the walls. But then, as he rounded a corner, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. At the center of the cave was an ancient stone altar, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The walls around the altar were adorned with carvings, depicting scenes of humans and otherworldly creatures, some of which seemed to be engaged in a battle for control of powerful energy. The symbols were unlike anything the protagonist had ever seen, but they felt familiar. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the altar. The moment his hand made contact, a jolt of energy shot through his body. It was the same energy he had felt before, the power that now flowed through his veins. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and the cave seemed to come alive with a strange hum. The protagonist's heart raced as he realized what this place was. This wasn't just any cave, it was a forgotten sanctuary, a place where the ancient powers of the universe had once been harnessed. It was a relic from a time long past, a time when humanity's ancestors had tapped into powers beyond imagination. And now he was here, standing in the heart of it all. He couldn't explain how he knew this, but it was clear. This was the source of his power, the very place that had been waiting for him to awaken. The Caldwell family's legacy wasn't just a bloodline. It was tied to something far older, something that connected humanity to the very fabric of the universe. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. It was faint at first, a whisper, but it grew clearer with each passing second. "You are the one," the voice said. "The legacy has returned. You are the key to the future." The protagonist felt a rush of understanding flood his mind. This power wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility. He wasn't just meant to survive. He was meant to lead, to guide humanity toward a future where they could stand among the stars, no longer weak or scattered. The legacy of the Caldwells was not just about power, it was about purpose. And now he understood what he had to do. The cave seemed to pulse with energy as the protagonist stood in awe. He had come here looking for answers, but now he realized that the answers had been within him all along. His journey was only beginning, and the path ahead was filled with dangers and challenges. But he was no longer afraid. The legacy of his ancestors had awakened, and he was ready to face whatever the galaxy had in store. With newfound determination, the protagonist stepped away from the altar. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity's place among the stars had been secured. The protagonist stood before the ancient altar, the air humming with energy. The discovery of the sanctuary had filled him with purpose, but the weight of his newfound responsibility was heavy. He had unlocked the secrets of the past, and with that knowledge came the realization that the galaxy was far more dangerous than he had imagined. The Praxians were only the beginning. There were other factions out there, ancient forces that would stop at nothing to control the power he had awakened. The voice in his mind, still faint but growing clearer, continued to speak, guiding him. "You must prepare. The galaxy will challenge you, but you must lead. Only then can humanity rise." His heart raced as the words echoed through him. It was clear now that his role was much greater than simply surviving. He had to fight for humanity's place in the galaxy, to ensure their survival and growth. The world around him seemed to shift, as though the planet itself was alive, waiting for his next move. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist stepped away from the altar and turned back toward the cave entrance. He had come here searching for answers, and now he knew what he had to do. But there was still so much to learn, so much more to understand about his powers and the threats that awaited him. Outside, the sky was darkening, the cold wind blowing across the barren landscape. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of the cave, where he had felt a deep connection to something greater. The protagonist knew he couldn't stay on this planet for long. He needed to gather allies, learn to harness his abilities, and prepare for the battles ahead. As he made his way back to the escape pod, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Praxians and the other factions were not waiting. They would be coming for him, and when they did, he needed to be ready. But as he approached the pod, a sharp, unfamiliar sound cut through the air. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he dropped to the ground, narrowly avoiding a blast of energy that scorched the ground where he had been standing just moments before. From the shadows, a group of figures emerged, strangers, but not enemies. They wore dark, advanced armor that shimmered with strange energy, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Their presence was both imposing and mysterious, and the protagonist knew immediately that these were not the Praxians. One of the figures stepped forward, their voice calm and clear. "You are not alone," the figure said. "We have been watching you." The protagonist stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Who were these people? Why were they here? "You are not the first to awaken," the figure continued, "and you will not be the last. But you are different. The power you've tapped into is not just a weapon. It's a key." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. A key. What did that mean? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We are the custodians," the figure said, "guardians of the legacy that you have just begun to understand. We have kept watch over humanity for millennia, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment has come." The protagonist's mind raced. The custodians, guardians of humanity. What was this legacy they spoke of? Before he could ask more questions, the leader of the custodians raised a hand, signaling to the others. They stepped aside, revealing a ship, large, sleek, and glowing with a faint blue light. It was unlike any ship the protagonist had ever seen, its design both futuristic and ancient at the same time. It seemed to pulse with energy, as though it was alive. "This ship," the leader said, "will take you to the place where your training will begin. It is the only way for you to fully unlock your potential. You must come with us, or you will not survive what is coming." The protagonist hesitated. His instincts told him that he couldn't trust these people fully, but his curiosity and the need for answers outweighed his caution. He had no choice but to follow them, at least for now. If they were telling the truth, this could be the key to unlocking his true potential and preparing for the coming storm. Without another word, the protagonist followed the custodians onto the ship. As he stepped inside, the ship's interior was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was vast, filled with strange technology, and illuminated by a soft, ethereal light. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and he could feel the power that ran through every inch of the vessel. The custodians led him to a chamber in the center of the ship, where a holographic map of the galaxy appeared in midair. The map was filled with glowing points, each one representing a different system, a different faction, a different threat. "Your training will begin here," the leader said, pointing to a distant star system on the map. "There you will meet others who have awakened, others who will join you in the fight to defend humanity. But you must first learn to control your power, to become the leader we know you are destined to be." The protagonist nodded, his mind filled with 1,000 questions. But there was no time to ask them. The galaxy was calling, and he had no choice but to answer. As the ship powered up, the protagonist felt a sense of both fear and excitement. His journey was just beginning, and the path ahead was unknown, but he was ready. The legacy of humanity had been awakened, and he would stand at its forefront, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ship hummed quietly as it made its way through the vastness of space. The protagonist stood near a window, staring out at the stars. The galaxy stretched endlessly before him, a sea of lights and darkness. His mind was still racing with the events of the past few days. From discovering his powers to meeting the custodians, everything had changed in an instant. But the most overwhelming part was yet to come: the training. The custodians had promised him that they would help him unlock his true potential, but the question still lingered in his mind. Was he ready? Could he really learn to control the power that had surged through him? He wasn't sure, but he had no choice. A galaxy was full of dangers, and he had a responsibility to protect humanity. The leader of the custodians had told him that his training would take place on a distant planet, a place where the ancient powers of the universe had once been harnessed. As the ship traveled toward its destination, the protagonist tried to prepare himself mentally. He had to be ready for whatever was coming. The journey took several days, during which the protagonist spent most of his time in quiet contemplation. The custodians were always nearby, but they said little, giving him space to think. Every now and then, one of them would approach him with a question or a piece of advice, but mostly, they let him reflect on his own. Finally, the ship arrived at its destination, a barren, rocky world on the edge of the galaxy. It was far from the major trade routes, isolated and forgotten by most. The planet's surface was pocked with deep craters and jagged cliffs. There was no sign of life, only a desolate landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. "We've arrived," the leader of the custodians said, his voice calm and steady. "This is where you will begin your training." The protagonist stepped off the ship, the dry, dusty air filling his lungs. It was a stark contrast to the comfort of the ship. The harsh environment seemed to match the task that lay ahead. Difficult, unforgiving, and full of unknowns. The custodians led him to a series of ancient structures, half buried in the sand. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Huge, imposing structures, built from materials that looked both alien and ancient. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air seemed to hum with a faint energy. "This is where the Ancient Ones once harnessed the power," the leader explained. "It was here that they learned to control the forces of the universe. You will do the same, but first, you must learn the basics." The protagonist nodded, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping into his chest. The gravity of the situation was starting to set in. He wasn't just learning to fight. He was learning to control a force that could shape the very fabric of reality. But how did one begin to learn something so vast? "You will start by connecting with the energy," the leader continued. "Feel it. Let it flow through you. Only then can you understand it." The protagonist closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The energy, the power, had always felt like a distant thing to him, something he could barely control. But here, in this place, it felt different. It was as if the planet itself was alive with energy, waiting for him to tap into it. He extended his hands slowly, palms open, and focused on the sensation. At first, nothing happened. His mind was filled with doubts and questions. What if he couldn't control it? What if it consumed him, just like it had when he first discovered it? But then, something changed. A faint pulse of energy flickered in his fingertips, like a spark in the dark. He focused on it, allowing the energy to grow, to flow through him. His hands began to glow with a soft, blue light, the same light he had seen when the power had first surged through him. At first, it was subtle, just a faint glow. But as he concentrated, the energy grew stronger. He felt it filling him, flooding his body with warmth and power. It was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it was also calming. He felt as though the energy was a part of him, like it had always been there, waiting for him to discover it. "Good," the leader said, watching from a distance. "You're beginning to connect, but don't stop there. Focus on controlling it. Let the energy bend to your will." The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to focus. He could feel the energy inside him, swirling, pushing against his control. It was like trying to hold onto a current in a river, powerful and unpredictable. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, and tried to push the energy forward. For a moment, nothing happened. He focused harder, his concentration sharpening. The energy surged, and with a sharp burst, a wave of blue light shot forward, crashing into a nearby rock. The rock cracked and shattered into pieces, the energy dissipating in a flash. The protagonist stood, stunned by what he had just done. He had never been able to control the power like that before. It had always been a chaotic force, something he couldn't manage. But here, in this place, he had done it. He had controlled it. The leader stepped forward, a slight smile on his face. "You are learning, but this is just the beginning. The energy you wield is both a gift and a burden. If you are to lead humanity, you must learn to control it completely." The protagonist nodded, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. This was just the beginning. He had tapped into something far greater than himself, and now it was up to him to learn how to wield it. As the sun began to set behind the ancient structures, the protagonist felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't alone in this. The custodians were here to guide him, and with their help, he would unlock the full extent of his power. And when the time came, he would lead humanity into the future. But first, he had to master the energy, and that was only the first step. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. The legacy of the past was in his hands, and he would not let it slip away. The sun set low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The protagonist stood at the edge of the training ground, feeling the weight of the day's lessons pressing down on him. He had learned to control the energy, at least a little, and had begun to understand its vast potential. But he knew that true mastery would take time. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the trials ahead, but the custodians had made it clear there was no time to waste. "You've made progress," the leader said as he approached, his voice calm but serious. "But now you will face the first trial." The protagonist turned to look at the custodian. "Trial? What kind of trial?" The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned toward the rocky hills in the distance. "Follow me," he said. The protagonist hesitated for only a moment before following. His mind raced with questions. What did the custodians mean by trial? Was this some kind of test of his abilities? Would it push him to his limits? As they walked, the custodian spoke again. "The energy you're learning to control is not just a tool. It's a force of nature. The first trial will test how well you can handle this force. It will push you beyond your comfort zone. And only by facing it head-on can you grow stronger." The protagonist nodded, trying to steady his breathing. The thought of facing an unknown challenge was unsettling, but he had already come this far. He wasn't about to back down now. They'd reached a narrow canyon, its steep walls rising high on either side. The air was thick with dust, and the ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. At the center of the canyon was a large stone structure, ancient and weathered, standing like a silent sentinel. "This is where the trial will take place," the custodian said. "You will face a creature that has been awakened by the energy in this place. It is a guardian, one of the ancient beings that once protected this world. Your task is simple: defeat it." The protagonist looked at the stone structure, his mind racing. A guardian? What kind of creature was it? And how was he supposed to defeat something that had been alive for thousands of years? "Don't worry," the custodian continued, sensing his doubts. "You are not alone in this. Your connection to the energy will guide you. Trust in yourself." The protagonist nodded, although the uncertainty lingered in his mind. He was still learning how to control the energy within him. How could he possibly defeat an ancient guardian if he couldn't even fully control his own power? Without warning, the ground shook beneath him, and a loud guttural roar echoed from deep within the canyon. The protagonist tensed, his eyes searching for the source of the sound. And then, from the shadows, a massive creature emerged. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was a strange mix of organic and stone-like features, with long, jagged spines running down its back. Its eyes glowed an eerie red, and its massive claws scraped the ground as it moved toward him, shaking the earth with every step. The protagonist felt a surge of fear rise within him. The creature was huge, twice the size of any beast he had ever encountered. But there was no time to hesitate. He had to face it, or he would fail this trial. The custodian's voice came from behind him, calm and steady. Focus. Trust in your training. The protagonist closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. He could feel the energy inside him, pulsing with power. He had learned to harness it before. Now he needed to push it to its limits. He raised his hands, and a faint blue light began to glow at his fingertips. The guardian roared again, charging toward him with terrifying speed. Without thinking, the protagonist extended his hands toward the creature, releasing a wave of energy. The force of it sent the guardian stumbling back, but it quickly recovered, more enraged than before. "Use your mind, not just your hands," the custodian called out. "The energy responds to your will. You must control it, not fight it." The words echoed in his mind, and the protagonist realized the truth in them. The energy was not just about raw power, it was about control. He had to connect with it on a deeper level. The creature lunged again, and this time, the protagonist was ready. He focused all his energy, not just on his hands, but on the entire battlefield. He could feel the ground beneath him, the air around him. He closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the energy swirling through the space, surrounding the guardian and trapping it. With a surge of focus, he unleashed the full force of the energy, not just in a wave, but as a focused stream that encased the creature. The guardian struggled, its massive body shaking with the force of the attack, but it was held in place. The energy wrapped around it, binding it, preventing it from moving. The protagonist's hands trembled with effort as he held the energy in place. His heart pounded in his chest, and sweat dripped from his brow. The guardian was strong, but the energy he controlled was stronger. He could feel it now. He was in control. With a final push, the energy intensified, and the guardian collapsed to the ground with a roar of defeat. The stone-like creature lay still, its eyes dimming as the energy drained from it. The protagonist stood panting, his body shaking from the exertion. The custodian walked forward, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence. "You have passed the first trial," the custodian said at last, his voice filled with approval. "You have proven that you can control the energy and use it to defend yourself." The protagonist took a deep breath, still processing what had just happened. He had done it. He had defeated the guardian. But the journey wasn't over. There was still much more to learn and much more to face. "You are ready for what comes next," the custodian said, his eyes meeting the protagonist's. "The path ahead will only get more difficult, but with each challenge, you will grow stronger." The protagonist nodded, his determination renewed. The trials were just beginning, but he was ready. The galaxy was waiting, and he would not fail humanity. The days on the barren planet had become a blur. The protagonist's training had intensified, each day bringing a new challenge. The custodians had pushed him beyond his limits, teaching him not just to control the energy, but to master it. But now, after everything he had been through, he was ready for the final test. The final trial was unlike any of the previous challenges. It was not about controlling power or defeating enemies. This time, the test would be about the strength of his mind and the depth of his understanding. He would have to face himself. The custodian leader stood before him, the familiar calm expression on his face. "You have done well so far," he said, "but this trial will be the most difficult. You will not face a creature, nor will you have to battle with force. This trial is about your connection to the energy. It is about understanding your true purpose and accepting the responsibility that comes with your power." The protagonist's heart raced at the leader's words. A test of his mind. Was he really ready for this? He had spent so much time learning about the energy, but he still wasn't sure if he fully understood it. And as for accepting the responsibility, he hadn't even begun to consider what that might mean. "Do not worry," the leader continued. "This is a trial of the mind and soul. Trust yourself and trust the energy. You are not alone in this." With that, the custodian stepped back, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. The ground beneath the protagonist's feet began to tremble, and the sky above darkened. The landscape around him blurred, as though reality itself was starting to dissolve. Before he could react, a figure appeared in front of him. It was him, but not exactly. This version of him was standing tall, confident, and powerful. His eyes glowed with the same blue energy that he had come to control, but there was something different about the way the power radiated from him. This version of himself was in full control, unafraid, unshaken. "You've come far," the reflection said, its voice a perfect echo of his own. "But do you truly understand what you've become, what you're capable of?" The protagonist stared at his reflection, confusion and doubt filling his mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've learned to control the power, but I'm still not sure what it all means." The reflection smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You're afraid. Afraid of the responsibility, afraid of the power you hold. You've spent so much time fighting and learning, but you haven't truly accepted who you are. You're not just a human anymore. You're something more." The protagonist stepped back, shaking his head. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as he looked into the reflection's eyes, he felt a deep unease settle in his chest. Was this what the custodians had been warning him about? Was this the true test? "You have the power to change the fate of the galaxy," the reflection continued. "You could shape the universe with a thought, create worlds or destroy them. But you fear the consequences. You fear what will happen if you lose control." The protagonist clenched his fists. "I'm not afraid," he said, though his voice wavered. "I just need to understand what I'm supposed to do with this power." The reflection laughed, its voice echoing in the empty space. "Understanding doesn't come from controlling the power. It comes from accepting it. You are not just a weapon to be wielded. You are the key to a new future. But first, you must accept who you are." The protagonist stood still, the weight of the words pressing down on him. This was the moment he had been avoiding, the moment when he would have to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. Did he want to be the hero, the one who protected humanity? Or would he become something darker, something lost to the power he controlled? The landscape around him began to change, shifting into flashes of moments from his past. Faces of people he had known, cities he had visited, battles he had fought, all of them swirling around him. It was overwhelming. And for a moment, he felt as though he might lose himself. But then something within him shifted. He remembered why he had come this far. He remembered his purpose. It wasn't about the power or the fear. It was about humanity. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, guiding them toward a better future. "I understand now," the protagonist said, his voice steady. "It's not about control. It's about balance. The power isn't meant to rule. It's meant to protect." The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of approval. "You've finally accepted your responsibility," it said, its voice now softer. "Now, you are ready." The landscape around him began to settle, the visions fading into the distance. The protagonist felt a sense of peace wash over him. The trial was over, and he had passed. He had learned that true power didn't come from control. It came from understanding and acceptance. As the world around him cleared, the custodian leader stepped forward once again. His expression was approving, though there was a hint of pride in his eyes. "You have completed the final trial," he said. "You are ready to lead." The protagonist nodded, his heart still heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The trials were over, but the journey was just beginning. The galaxy was waiting, and it was up to him to shape its future. He turned to face the stars, a sense of purpose growing within him. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready. He had accepted his power, and now he would use it to protect humanity and guide them into the future. The galaxy was his to shape, and he would not fail.